Little backstory. So when our teaching team talked about what it would look like to talk about some of our issues that we've been through, I was at a really high point in life. I felt like the Lord had carried me through a lot of valleys. And I was like, yeah, I'll take isolation, anxiety, and depression. I can talk about that. And then Satan just pulled me right back into it. And so I can say that I've been through it. That's what I can say. And so I've had about 8 sermons planned since the day I said yes to that topic till today. And actually even last night struggled in dealing with, maybe I should just stay quiet about this. Maybe I could just be a little bit more superficial. I don't really need to go into it because it's raw and it's hard and it's my life. And so I have a box of tissues up here because if you know me, I cry, and my nose runs when I speak, so you're welcome. So just be prepared. I'm also going to stay pretty close to my notes because the Lord at 6:30 this morning said, let me just keep you on your toes. Let's give the girl who deals with anxiety some anxiety, and let's just redo her message for this morning. So again, you're welcome for showing up to the 9 a.m. But I love that our church is going through these hard topics because it is easy for us to think of people that stand on stages and share the gospel that they've got it together. And I'm going to stand up here today and say, I sure as heck don't have it together, and I'm still going through it, and I'm still battling, but I really want to share with you what I have learned about what the Lord has shared with me in conquering some of this. And so today's anxiety and depression and isolation. And I think if we're being real, coming off of a holiday week, some of you have great holiday memories. But for a lot of you, the holidays they dredge up a lot of stuff. You might have anxiety of hanging out with your family because you might have that crazy one. And if you don't have that crazy one, I saw a meme the other day, you are the crazy one. Family is hard. The holidays bring up loss. Some of you know my story. Over the last 10 years, I've lost both my parents to cancer. I walked through caregiving. I shaved heads when chemo took away hair. I did the hard work of that. And so the holidays are not my favorite thing. I actually spent Thanksgiving by myself this year because I knew that I needed to do it. I needed to show myself that I could do it, that I could stand up strong, that grief would not take me out this year. And so I want to just encourage you as we talk about some of these hard things, it's not the end. And we can not just stop in the despair and the defeat, but we have to focus on the hope and what's to come. And so when I was thinking about anxiety, specifically my own anxiety, we all have anxiety in some way, right? Like even at 2 a.m. this morning, I woke up and I said, did I lock the front door when I went to bed? You know, those little things that creep up. Did I put the garage door down when I left, right? Like they just creep up. Oftentimes I'm driving down to work and I'm driving down the hill and I go, I don't think I shut the garage door. And then I try and replay all my steps so that I could keep driving so I can be on time to work. And if you're like me, you end up turning around, driving past your house and realizing, yes, you did put the garage door down and now you are 10 minutes late for work. So we all have those pieces. The other part is some of us have already experienced depression. There's a statistic out that a majority of us will have at least one major depressive state in our lifetime. And if you haven't experienced it, unfortunately, it's to come because there's loss in our world. There's hard things, and God gave us emotion to experience it. I have dealt with a lot of loss in my life. And so we all experience it in some way, whether we lose a loved one, whether you have to put down a family pet, whether you have financial hardship in a season, or whether you're just having a bad day at work, there's still those sad emotions. And so I thought that that was what anxiety and depression were. Little did I know the journey that the Lord would have me on for this last year. In January, every year, Young Life sends us to a class, and it changes every year depending on how many years you've been on staff. And so this last year, I got to spend time with my colleagues in a class that deals with emotion. Not my favorite class, coming off of a pandemic and losing my mother. But I bucked up and said, we're going to do it. And so I sat in this class and learned what emotion does to people who share the gospel, and how we deal with it, and what that does to our hearts on a daily basis. There's this thing of that when we sit with people who are in those really hard moments, you start to take that on. But Jesus says we don't have to. And so we sat in this class, and then all of a sudden the slide turned to depression and anxiety. And I was like, oh, okay. And the guy who was teaching our class started to go through some of these signs and symptoms of it. And for the first time, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, you are tiptoeing in a water that you do not want to tiptoe in, Lindsay. And here's why. Because for some of us that stand up here, or that we share the gospel, or that we minister to others, it feels like there's a stigma in saying, I have mental health issues. There's a stigma when I say, I'm not perfect and I don't have it together. There's a stigma of being real and raw and crying on a stage because I've experienced real life. And I thought to myself, okay, pull it together. You're going to do what you teach and what you encourage and what you prepare other people to do. So I went back to, I've been in counseling for a very long time. Thank you, family trauma. And so I've been in counseling for a really long time. I finally started to say, okay, I need to go regularly. Like, it's not going to be the first thing that I cancel in my week when my week gets hard. So I started going regularly. And then I made myself be really vulnerable with my counselor, like really vulnerable in a way that I just didn't want to have to share, like the inside, like the ugly cry. No one wants to share that, but I did, and I did it. And so then I did the other things. I made sure that I had a regular rhythm and a prayer routine, and I walked through Bible plans on my phone about anxiety, and I prayed that the Lord would heal my heart. And none of that worked in that moment. And now I need you to hear me. I'm not saying that those pieces are bad, but I was so quick to grasp the things that I thought would heal this, but I didn't want to do this internal work with him. I didn't want to have to go there and figure it out, because I was supposed to have it all together. I was supposed to be the perfect one. I had a standard that I lived by. I looked good on the outside, and to deal with this with him meant that there were going to be a lot more ugly cry sessions. There were going to be some words that Jesus and I were going to have together. There was going to be real emotion that I would have to have with him. And so I got a little bit better. I was good at pulling myself together. Let me just say that. I was good at pulling myself together because I would have friends or people around me, and by no fault of their own, they would say things like, Linz, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do this. You can get it together. You should keep better rhythms. If you keep yourself busy, you won't have to think about it. If you get out of bed and you shower and you get dressed for the day, that sets you up for success. You should pray harder, read more scripture. But what these people didn't know is that all of those things would throw me into a really unhealthy rhythm, a really unhealthy cycle, because what I know to do is to work harder, to be better, to do more. And so I found myself at work saying yes to projects that I actually didn't need to be doing, because I thought if I could keep myself busy, then I wouldn't think about how miserable I was. So every morning, I would get out of bed at a normal time, because that's what people suggest and the internet suggests how to deal with depression. And so I would get up at a normal time, and I would get in the shower, and I would get dressed, and I would be prepared for the day. And then I would sit at my desk, and my brain would be so overwhelmed that I couldn't think about one thought. I lived constantly thinking, what if? I need to be doing this. And when you live like that, and you can't conquer one task for the day, you feel like a failure. And then I would get to the afternoon, and so my brain is spinning all the time, but I would sit paralyzed at my desk, staring at my computer, being like, pull yourself together, Lindsay, you got dressed for the day. You're prepared. You can do this. And then I would have to cancel appointments by the afternoon because my anxiety would be so high, or I would have believed, you need to stay home so that you can actually get stuff done. But in all reality, I was avoiding people that were going to ask, how are you doing? I was living in isolation because the isolation, living in the fear and the loneliness, and all of that was easier than having to have people address what was really going on. I would be relieved by the time I got into bed at night that the day was finally over. And then there's this pesky little thing that comes in, shame. Shame to tell me that, man, you didn't do anything today, Linz. People are donating their money so that you can do mission work, and you haven't left your house in weeks. What kind of missionary are you? Shame would creep in until finally anxiety would pop its ugly head up at 2 a.m. and remind me of all the things I didn't get done. The to-do list. And please, I can tell you, I've tried everything. I've tried all the tricks. Write down your to-do list. It'll clear your head. Get up and take a walk. Get a glass of water. Meditate, pray, count sheep. I've done it all. And by 6 a.m., I was back in stage 1, depression and being paralyzed. My life was miserable on the inside, but on the outside, I still looked good. I still showed up when anxiety wasn't too hard, and if it was, I would send a last-minute text saying something came up, when really I was still in my pajamas on my couch, paralyzed because I couldn't leave. I hate admitting that to people. I hate having to admit that I was lying to my closest friends and family because I was hurting so bad. Because I didn't want them to see the mess that I was really living in. I would show up when I really needed to. I would plaster a smile on my face, and when people said, how are you doing? I would chuckle and be like, I'm hanging in there. And on the inside, I'm thinking, please don't ask me any more questions, because I can't come up with any more answers. There was a statistic that I wanted to share with you because I don't think I'm the only one that battles in this. In 2020, they did a survey, and 62% of respondents experienced some degree of an anxiety. That impacts 40 million adults in the US. 7.3 million have had at least one major depressive episode. But we don't talk about it. And if the church isn't talking about it, then no one else is. We've got to be the leader in talking about this stuff. We've got to be real. We've got to train up people who are sharing the gospel to say, me too, I get it. I'm with you. I hear you. I see you. We have got to start standing up for our people because I know I'm not the only one. And so I need you to hear me very clearly in this. I have never once doubted God's goodness in all of this. I never lost faith in him. I never lost faith in who he is or what he's done for me. I lost faith in me. I lost faith in who he said I am. Because for the first time in my life, and this was a hard reality, the identity that I actually lived into, which was perfectionism, high expectations, that can do it all, full plate, I have it all together, wasn't working. I knew that I couldn't fix this on my own. and I couldn't work harder, be more presentable, just suck it up, or do anything to make this go away. In June, I was sent to serve at a Young Life camp, and every summer we get the opportunity to serve and in some way at our camps all across the country. And so I worked really hard to get this position as camp speaker. I fooled a lot of people into thinking that I was okay. But I said, I'm not going to give it up. I knew how bad I was on the inside, and I said, I'm not going to give it up. And not just because I wanted the image factor. I wanted it because I knew that Jesus had something for me. I knew if I could get to camp that Jesus would share something with me. And so I was sent to camp, and I was sent to share how to follow Jesus. And I could actually share that really well. I do know how to follow Jesus. But what I didn't know is what Jesus would share with me. Over and over again in the Gospels, we read about how Jesus showed up in the lives of broken individuals and changed their trajectory. He made them better. But what we often don't talk about is how he, God of the universe, creator of each and every one of us, God with skin on, made them better. And so there are 3 accounts that I want us to look at today. We're going to first start at the woman at the well in John 4. Now, I love the woman at the well. Yep, nose is already running, so this is good. Here we go. I feel like the Lord always has something, or the Holy Spirit, because when the nose starts running, here he goes. Okay, so I'm going to pick up, there's some stuff before it about how Jesus was getting in some trouble, and so then he has to go through Samaria. Now, a little background about Samaria. Jews did not cross into Samaria because Samaria was considered the half-breed country. They would rather stay away. Racial division 2,000 years ago. Not Jesus. Here he comes. He's like, you know what? I'm going to go straight through Samaria. And that's where we pick up. To get there, he had to pass through Samaria. He came into Sychar, a Samaritan village that had bordered the field Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was still there. Jesus, worn out by the trip, sat down at the well. It was noon. Here's what I want to highlight. Jesus is tired. We have God with skin on who actually has human emotion. He was thirsty. He was tired. It would have taken him about 2.5 days walking 3.5 miles per hour to do this journey. I probably would have given up 30 minutes in. You get to being that hot, and I'm like, I could go home. Not Jesus. This is how intentional he is. A woman, a Samaritan, came to draw water. Jesus said, would you give me a drink of water? His disciples had gone to the village to buy food for lunch. It's noon, and a woman has come to the well. That is a womanly duty in the morning and in the evening. She's hiding. She's isolating herself. She's avoiding. The Samaritan woman, taken aback, asked, how come you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? Jews in those days wouldn't be caught dead talking to Samaritans, let alone a woman, let alone a Jew with a Samaritan woman. Jesus answered, if you knew the generosity of God and who I am, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you fresh living water. Now, the woman is very confused, and I don't blame her because Jesus is talking in a metaphor, and you're like, so do you want to drink of water or not? Where are we at with this, right? Tell me, what's going on? Jesus continues. The woman said, sir, you don't even have a bucket to draw with, and this is deep. So how are you going to get this, quote, living water? Are you better than our ancestor Jacob, who dug this well and drank from it, and his sons and livestock, and passed it down to us? And Jesus replies, everyone who drinks this water will get thirsty again and again. Anyone who drinks the water I give will never thirst, not ever. The water I give will be an artesian spring within, gushing fountains of endless life. Now, I need you to hear this from a woman who is so desperate to hide that she is hiking to a well in the hot midday in order to avoid gossip, community, people that know her story. She says this out of such desperation, and my heart breaks for her. The woman said, "Sir, give me this water so I won't ever get thirsty. I won't ever have to come back to this well again." And I love Jesus in this moment. He said, "Go and call your husband and then come back." She replies, "I have no husband." She said, "That's nicely put. I have no husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now isn't even your husband. You spoke the truth there, sure enough." We skip down a little bit more, and this is what Jesus says, and this is what stands out in this passage to me. He says, "It's who you are and the way you live that count before God." He didn't say, "Well, if only we would clean up your act, or if you would stop sleeping around, or if you would do all of these things, then we can talk." He says, it's who you are. He calls her out just as she is. And the way that you live, that's what counts before God. It continues, your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people that the Father is looking for. Those who are simply and honestly themselves before him in their worship. God is a sheer being itself, the Spirit. Those who worship him must do it out of their very being, their spirits, their true selves, in adoration. The story continues that she says, I don't know what you're talking about. She gets into some religiosity of like, how should I worship? Where should we worship? All of these things. And he's like, lady, that is not the point of this. The point of it is I want you to worship just as you are. And then she talks about how the Messiah is coming. Jesus actually reveals himself to her as the Messiah. I can't even imagine the peace that overcomes her. And then she drops her bucket and runs back. Back in the village, she told the people, come see a man who knew all about the things I did, who knows me inside and out. Do you think this could be the Messiah? And they went out to see for themselves. Now, here are some things that I want you to take away from this account. This woman was so anxious about being known that she went to the well at noon. We know that. She was so isolated from a community of women and men because of her past mistakes. And Jesus didn't intentionally go to Samaria to call her out on her business. He went to Samaria to intentionally remind her of who she is. A woman more than just her mistakes. He calls her back to her true identity of worshiping God out of her true self and not the concoction that she's created out of shame, anxiety, and isolation. She feels so seen and heard and cared for that out of freedom, for the first time in a really long time, she returns to the same community that shamed and isolated her to begin with, just to share about Jesus. She can be her true self in all her glory, not because of her flippantly forgetting her past, but truly remembering her identity. That's powerful. We'll see in another scripture, in the man at Bethesda. I'll read faster so we can actually go home today. It's okay. So, we'll skip down. They're having a feast, and then Jesus comes across hundreds of sick people. We're in John 5. Hundreds of sick people, blind, crippled, paralyzed, were in these alcoves. It's a big pool, just so you know. One man had been an invalid there for 38 years. Now, let me just tell you a little bit of context, cultural context in that. They would have been shunned. They would have been sent off to a community by themselves because in that day and age, in that culture, they would have been seen as doing something wrong, that they had sinned against God or their parents had, and so they were being punished by being a person with special needs. Now, our world, thankfully, has started to change in that mind, but we love to send people out. We love to push them away. We love to say, you're different than us. 38 years. I'm not even 38, and I can't imagine living in that life of isolation. I've lived it for more than one, and it hasn't been fun. 38 years this man sat and waited to be healed. And when Jesus saw him stretched out by the pool and knew how long he had been there, he said, "Do you want to get well?" Now, there's like some little background superstition. An angel would come down and stir the pool, and then you would lower yourself into the pool and you would get healed. Now, we know that contextually there are a bunch of temples and a bunch of different religions around there that would have probably caused that religious idea or that superstition. But I read in one commentary when it said, "Do you want to get well?" It says, "Are you really ready to abandon how you see yourself and receive the faith for his healing?" Are you really ready to stop living in this identity that people have told you that you are? Because you would sit there for 38 years, and I can imagine, because I've sat in it for over a year, feeling helpless, hopeless, watching everyone else's life pass them by. I can't imagine the depression, the desperation, the isolation. And Jesus didn't see him or us as helpless or hopeless or messy. He sees us in our true identity as the heir, the victor, and the conqueror of our circumstances. And why? Because he's already done it. He is the victor. He is the conqueror of all circumstances. And so this sick man replies, "I can't get in the pool." And then Jesus goes, "You don't even need that. You need me. Get up and go." And he does. He doesn't deal with just the outward side of it. He deals with the identity of the hopelessness, the victim mentality. And man, have I been there. On paper, I have a long list of reasons that I can live as a victim. I have a lot of trauma that I still haven't gotten to. But Jesus says you don't have to live in it. You don't have to sit in it. Surely not for 38 years. You are a victor of your circumstance. Next one. Yep, you're welcome. We're going to go through all the scriptures today. Just kidding. Okay, last one. And I love that this is the scripture because I think it's funny. Not funny, because Jesus always has a plan. I think he's actually kind of funny the way he does stuff, because I think he's laughing about this. But we have gone through the woman that had bled for 12 years. This will now be the third time it's been brought up in this church. And I think that God has something for us in this scripture in such a way that maybe we haven't heard it before. He's going to speak something through you in this. And whether that was Otto's message or Jen's message or this message today, there's something for you in this. So on his return, Jesus was welcomed by a crowd. People are obviously understanding that Jesus is different. They were all there expecting him. A man came up, Jairus by name. He was the president of the meeting place, and he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his home because of his 12-year-old daughter. His only child was dying. Jesus went with him, making his way through the pushing, jostling crowd. Think about the identity that Jairus would have. He'd be rich. He would have it all together. And in just an instant, he becomes so desperate for Jesus to be able to do something that his money can't buy, something that his power in that world couldn't do. He had to rely on someone else. He had to allow someone else to enter into his mess. As someone who doesn't like to let people into my own mess, I can only imagine the anxiety he has in being able to share that. Because my knees shook before I had to stand up here today to share what my anxiety looked like. And so he goes to Jesus in pure desperation. And I've been there. I had asked over and over again for the Lord to heal my parents, to save them. I knew they were dying. And so I can't imagine the brokenheartedness that he comes and lays at Jesus' feet. And then Jesus says yes. I'd be like, what? Oh, let's go, right? Like, come on, move along. And so in the midst of it, in the crowd that day, there was a woman for 12 years that had been afflicted with hemorrhages. She'd spent every penny she had on doctors, but not one had been able to help her. Culturally, she shouldn't have ever even been in this crowd. She would have been bleeding. Bleeding is unclean in Jewish tradition. She would have had to yell unclean before she entered into a place. Can you imagine yelling anxiety, depression, isolation? No, right? No one wants to call out their mess. So can you imagine this woman? She was desperate for healing. She has spent every dime looking for something to heal her. And she has to yell unclean, or not even be there would have been the appropriate response because she would have been a woman. And so in her desperation, she clings to knowing something's got to be better than this. She slipped in from behind and touched the edge of Jesus' robe, and at that very moment, her hemorrhages stopped. Jesus said, "Who touched me?" Our all-knowing God with skin on, he knew dang well who touched him. Right? That would have not been out of his thought process. But he wants to call her out intentionally, and not for her uncleanliness or her mess. He wants to see her, and he knows that she needs to be seen. She needs to be heard. She needs to be known. And so he says, "Who touched me?" Well, when no one stepped forward, Peter said, "But Master, we've got crowds of people on our hands and dozens have touched you." Peter's like, "Are you for real, Jesus? Like, people have been bumping into you and you want to know who touched you in the midst of this crowd?" This is obviously pre-pandemic, people. So social distancing wasn't a thing, obviously. So Jesus insisted, "Someone touched me. I felt the power leaving me." Our all-knowing God knew that something had changed. And when the woman realized that she couldn't remain hidden, there's going to be a moment in your life where you cannot remain hidden. And what are you going to do with it? She knelt trembling before him. My hope is that when I get to heaven, that Jesus will look at me and he will say, "There was a moment when you knew you couldn't remain hidden and you knelt before me." That's what I want for the church. She knelt trembling before him, and in front of all the people, she blurted out her story, why she touched him and how that at that same moment she was healed. Jesus heard her whole story. Now I think about that and what that would look like. There's crowds of people everywhere, and Jesus is like, "Time out. So just tell me what happened in the last 24 hours. No. He sits down with her. She's kneeling, and he says, "Tell me the whole thing from the top. I want to hear every bit about it." Can you imagine having Jesus hear your whole story? He knows it. He knew her inside and out, right? He knows who has touched his cloak, but he wants to hear it from her words, her voice, how she's experienced it, her perception of it, her reality. And while he was still, and Jesus said, "Daughter, you took a risk trusting me, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed." She has been seeking everything, and in that moment, she is full. She is whole. And while he was still talking, someone from the leader's house came up and told him, "Your daughter died. No need to bother the teacher." Jesus overheard and said, "Don't be upset, just trust me, and everything will be all right." Going into the house, he wouldn't let anyone enter with him except for Peter, John, James, and the child's parents. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her, Stop wailing, Jesus said. She's not dead, but asleep. Here's something I think that we need to hear. You can be dead on the inside and look pretty alive on the outside. You can be asleep at the wheel. But I love that Jesus calls it out in this moment. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead, but he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat, and her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone for what had happened. Listen to the compassion that Jesus speaks to both of these girls. He says, "Daughter, my child, you are healed, you are whole, you are alive." In this one account, we watch Jesus conquer disease and death, whether that is emotional or physical. And I know that a lot of us have experienced both of those things. So here's what I need you to hear. I love in another scripture, he says, "Go in peace" to the woman who had been healed. I can't imagine. She hasn't known peace in a really long time. Because I know that when Jesus speaks to me, there's true peace that comes over my circumstances. And then when he tells Jairus, "Trust me, everything will be all right," he doesn't say, "Oh, and all of a sudden unicorns are going to come down and gold confetti." I wish. That would be really great. But he says, "Everything will be all right if you trust me." He brings something to the table that our circumstances and us trying to fix cannot. And that is the power of Jesus. These aren't the only scriptures where Jesus doesn't do something miraculous. The Gospels are full of them. And yes, he changes the outside, but only because he says to the heart of these people, "I see you, I hear you, and I'm for you." We are so quick to say, "But that's for the paraplegic that waited for 38 years, or that's for the woman who has a life of shame, or that's for the woman who suffered health issues." But I need you to hear the gospel is for you. You and your paralysis of depression, you and your anxiety of being truly known, you and your isolation and your mess. And every time Jesus showed up, he showed up for them in their true identity. And they walked away transformed because they got to walk in freedom. And so why do we hold ourselves back from that? That month in June, when I got to spend time at that camp, I got to walk in a new form of freedom that I had never walked before. I showed up in a community that I didn't know, and no one knew me. No one had preconceived notions of who Lindsay Bridges is or should be. I was able to speak and encourage and build and love because for the first time in a really long time, I could hear Jesus speak, encourage, build, and love me in my truest self, in my mess. I was able to live in what I would assume is the real life as it was created to be. The hard part is, camp is not real life, as much as I wish it was. And so even on that way home, on that drive home, I said, I don't know if I can go back. Once you experience the taste of freedom, there's nothing like that ever before. And so I had this conversation with the Lord as I drove home that day. And he said to me, it's a choice you get to make. There are still days that I feel like the woman at the well that gets remembered for the long list of trauma that I've experienced. But that's not my true identity, and it's not yours. That's not the true worshiper of Jesus that we are. There are days when I still struggle with my depression and isolation, like the man that sat at the pool, feeling like life is passing me by while I figure out how to do one task at a time. And Jesus asks me if I'm willing to let go of my perception of myself and take on the identity that he's given me as a victor and a conqueror. There are days that I feel anxious and lowly and not enough to enter a crowd because of my own mess, my own filth. And Jesus says, tell me your story again from the top because I care. And I want to heal you, and I want you to walk in your true identity as a daughter of the King. And then there are days in my depression and feeling like I'm lonely and that I'm dying on the inside because I've got to have it all together. And he reminds me to trust in him and everything will be all right. It won't be perfect, but it'll be all right. Not because of anything I can do or how well I can do it, but because of who he is, what he's done, and how well he did it. Life is hard and there's no way around it. So I don't want to negate what you've been through, because we all have a long list, I'm sure. We at least have the last 2 years of craziness on our list. I also don't want to negate the fact that all of those pieces I put in play long before I started this journey, they are available to each and every one of us to help us remember our true identity. You need community. You need prayer. You need scripture. You need all of those things so that you remember who he has created you to be, not what you can do. And so I just want you guys to remember these things. Can we put that up on the screen? Maybe. Here are some truths that I felt that the Lord needed me to share this morning. You are more than your past, and Jesus does not shame. You are a victor and not a victim. And you are a conqueror in whatever he has taken you through. And you are worthy of being seen and heard and healed. You are more than the mess that you are living in. And you can be messy and still walk in freedom in the midst of all that mess. You do not have to be perfect. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps or just do more. Or work harder. You are perfect just as you are. I want to lead us into a time of communion. I want us to remember that what he did on the cross is enough. And that gives us victory over depression and isolation and shame. That is enough. And in this moment, I want you to spend time. Tell him the story from the beginning, one more time, because he wants to hear from you. He wants to remind you of your true identity. Cast out the lies that have been spoken over you because they're not true. And it might be a really loud whisper, but we have a God who speaks louder. And so speak the truth over yourself. And while it's hard to think of being joyous in the midst of some really hard stuff that we're going through, I want to just cast that over us prophetically as a church, but also as a people, that we can rejoice in the healing that's to come. It might not be right now, but it will come. I want to rejoice in the hope of how Jesus is going to show off in your life and use your story to be impactful for our kingdom and not to stay hidden. And I want to rejoice in you walking in freedom. And I do believe that today we will see some of that. And so if you are a person that needs prayer, that you want some freedom, I'm going to invite you up. I'm going to ask you to not stay hidden, because shame would tell you to stay in your seat. It would tell you that, even I feel that when I sit in our chairs, like, Lindsay, you can't go up for prayer. You're supposed to have it all together. That is not true. And so if you need healing over this or something else, I want to encourage you to come forward. I'm going to invite our prayer team up. And so let's just listen to how Jesus wants to rejoice with us.